Ryan Burge, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I think I want to begin by with a maybe somewhat unorthodox start, but I think is a nice segue for the conversation. I think you've mentioned this a few times before, but could you explain the ways in which America was essentially founded under like a Protestant spirit, at least like to a greater extent than other denominations?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at American religion at the founding of our country, it was all Protestant Christianity. I think I read a stat the other day that at the founding there were like 35,000 Catholics in the entire United States, and just an infinitesimally small number of Jewish people. So we were founded. If you look back at the founding story of America, it was founded by Puritans. Puritans are Protestants, and they brought a lot of people over. So congregational churches were big, Baptist churches, Methodist churches were not big yet, but they were growing. I mean, Protestant Christianity was really the only religion in colonial America, and really dominated for most of American history until the last 100 years or so. So, I mean, that's really the Protestant ethic is deeply rooted in America because of that.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned this on Khan's podcast once, but I do think that Americans often project some of their own ideas about religion onto the rest of the world. So do you think that our roots when it comes to Protestantism end up unintentionally like giving us a distorted picture about how we could see religion elsewhere?
Oh, I mean, listen, we always compare what we see to what we know. And that's true east, west, north, south. And I think the problem doing that in religion is that there's no other country on earth that's like America when it comes to religion. I mean, nowhere close, because we are both incredibly religious and incredibly economically prosperous and incredibly religiously diverse. Like if you look even at Germany, I mean, it's dominated by one religious tradition. France used to be. Most of these countries, when they were religious, it was like one type of Christianity was dominant there. And in America, there's pockets of that. For instance, Utah has LDS, for instance, and there's Catholic places in the Northeast. But man, a lot of America has like a good mix of, mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants and black Protestants and Catholics, and then, non-religious people and then other religious. So that's why it's really, really hard for an Americanist like I am, who studies religion, to take anything that he or she has learned in the American context and then try to apply it to a non-American context, because it's just like you're operating from a different set of principles. And it's really, America is one of one when it comes to religion. That's why I always joke, I never get invited to speak anywhere except America, because that's all I know and all I study, and we're just so unique.
Do you think that you've ever like made any sort of mistakes or like unintentionally projected your own worldview when it comes to trying to figure out how religious affiliation works in other countries?
Well, I'll say this. I don't do a whole lot of work with religion in other countries for that very reason. I am an incredibly Amerocentric person. I have left the United States 5 times in my life. I've left North America 0 times in my life. I've never been to Europe. I've never been to Asia. I've never been to, Australia. I've never even been to Hawaii. I've been to Mexico a couple times, and Canada. That's it. So I have very little context when it comes to what's going on in the rest of the world. Where I do make mistakes, and this is something that I'm very cognizant of, is I grew up in a very specific way. I grew up evangelical in the 1990s, grew up in rural America, um, grew up in a blue collar family, and all those things impact how I think about religion. Like I'm still a religious person to this day. I'm still a pastor of a church. And that's my perspective. I have a hard time understanding a non-religious perspective, because I am in fact non-religious. And so I have to constantly sort of steer the boat away from my own bias and try to answer questions that I don't feel particularly comfortable trying to answer, So part of what I do on my Substack is write posts that I don't really know that much about, which can end up in me making mistakes. But I think that's also part of the process, is trying to expand and get beyond my own limited view of the world.
Yeah, and like sort of pressure you to like do research beyond your comfort zone, essentially.
That's so in for pastors, one of the biggest things they have to worry about is just preaching the same passages over and over again, the same ideas over and over again, just kind of their hobby horses. And I intentionally chose something called the lectionary, which makes you preach on a different passage every day, every Sunday, and then every 3 years it rolls over. That's the same thing in research. If you look at the research agenda of even prolific researchers, they basically do the same thing over and over again. It's just variations on a theme. And I think it's just really, really hard to start doing something else because, like, if you ask me to write a literature review on something to do with religion and politics in America, I could probably write 80% of it without looking up anything because I just know that literature. But if you ask me to write about, trade flows in Central Asia, I would have to start from scratch. So I'd basically be a first year graduate student. So I think it's just we fall into ruts because it's just easier for us to do with what we know. And I also will say this, the value in that is that I probably think about religion and politics more than almost anyone on the planet, which means I have a more nuanced, understated, understanding view of how things work. So, I always tell you pay me to think a lot about a certain thing. Like that's what academics are paid to do. And to spread myself thin means would I rather know a little about a whole lot or a whole lot about a little? There's a lot of people who know a little about a whole lot. You don't get paid for that. You get paid for knowing a whole lot about a very specific niche of society, culture, technology, the economy. And so I've just become sort of hyper specialized in what I do. And, I guess it's been successful. I don't know. I don't know what would define success here.
To what extent do you think the rise of like Substack and the fact that you're a prominent Substacker, to what extent do you think that's helped you like fast track your own ability to do research in all these areas compared to like just trying to float these ideas strictly through like published academia?
Yeah. So there's this disease in academics that I identified very quickly, which is I've got to make it perfect before I try to send it out for review. Academics, I don't know if you knew this or not, are very type A people. A lot of anal retentive people in academia, a lot of very perfectionistic type of people. And with Substack, the mentality is just ship it. You know what I mean? Like stop futzing over it. Just get it out there in the world and see what happens. And like the ideas that I think are stupid and I half-baked posts that I really don't think hang well together do really, really well. And sometimes one I'm really, really proud of and did all this work on don't go anywhere. So, in many ways, it's like this is just a numbers game. All it is a numbers game. Put more and more content out there, and you will see what the people want. And I think in many ways, that's made me a better academic because now I know what arguments people find compelling and can build upon those arguments. And then I find that the kind of areas that people don't care about, and I write less about that. So why not give people what they want to know more about, as opposed to trying to say, "Hey, look over here, look over here." So I think the immediacy of Substack has made me like stop overthinking about things and just throw some graphs together and some sort of incoherent thoughts sometimes, and just let it out in the public sphere and let people deal with it and process it, and you're going to get some good feedback sometimes.
Yeah, so maybe that's the origin of like your Substack name, where like Matt Iglesias, like for his Substack, it would just be like, oh, this is this like really fancy quote from Weber about like this is the strong and slow boring of hard words. The origin of your Substack is that you're just throwing graphs about religion together.
I mean, when I started the Substack, it was kind of like in a huff. I was grumpy because Elon had changed something else on Twitter and I was mad about it. And I just realized that like I need to diversify my platform because Twitter, A, was just getting toxic and I didn't like what Elon was doing. And B, I wasn't making any money doing it. And C, I wasn't really having fully formed thoughts on, or not, I was incredibly unformed thoughts on Twitter. So I thought if I went to Substack, that would A, give me control over my platform because now I own the email list. B, allow me to have more fully formed thoughts, and C, actually make some money on this whole enterprise. And so like all those three things together told me like Substack is such a better way to do things than it's also more reputable for whatever stupid reason that is. Like people are like, oh, I saw you tweet, and almost like there's like indignation in that word. But if they see, oh, I read your news, a lot of people don't even know what Substack is. I have subscribers who, are paying subscribers, don't know what Substack is. All they know is they get my emails twice a week. So that gives you like a level of credibility that other platforms don't give you. And I think for whatever reason, people see it as more legitimate than any other form of social media right now. So for me, it's just been a win-win.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I found interesting about your analysis about what you found beneficial to Substack is that it's helped you have more of your finger on the pulse in terms of like when it comes to you throwing together graphs about religion, you're better at understanding which specific topics when it comes to changes in religious attendance, like which specific topics people care about and which ones you thought they would care about, but they actually don't care about. So what, like, when it comes to your findings, so like, what are some like, what's some commentary that you've made about religion where you've been surprised by like how much people have cared about it?
I wrote a post about clergy in colonial America a couple weeks ago, which I thought was like the dumbest post ever. Like I was just like, this is silly. Like, I mean, this date is fun, don't get me wrong, but like how many people can honestly care about like 4,000, over 4,000 clergy records from 1763 to 1783? And I published that, and I was like, I bet if like like half my normal number reads this, it'll be a success. And that posted the exact same numbers that everything else does, which just tells me like at some point you get a loyal readership and you just say like, hey, I found this cool thing. It's a little off the beaten path. It's still about religion, but here, let me show you what religion looked like in colonial America. And it's like you give people, you feed them this diet of the same stuff over and over again, which they really do like. But then every once in a while you just change it up a little bit and they go, oh, I like a little bit of that too. Like I like a little bit of variation. And so there's been a couple examples like that. Like I'll write a post and I'll just sit there. Like I wrote a post about people aren't having sex anymore, which is not really about religion, by the way. It was just about sex, which is kind of about religion. But that post has been read 3 times as much as any other post on my Substack right now. And I would have never guessed. I thought it was going to do well, but I would have never thought it would have done like, multiples of what a typical post does. So at the end of the day, if anyone on this planet would know what was going to go viral on social media when it comes to religion, it would be me. And I still can't figure out what the formula is. There's just something like, like indescribable and illogical about what makes things go viral one time. And then you could tweet the same thing 3 times over a period of, let's say, 8 or 10 or 12 months. And one would get 1,000 retweets and one would get 300 retweets and one would get 18 retweets. The exact same thing. And thank God this is not my full-time job, because it would drive me crazy as an analytical person to try to figure out what causes those things to happen. At some point, like I said, I learned something very valuable. There's this guy, this big TikToker doing an interview, and he was asked about making content. He goes, here's the thing about the internet. You can make 50 posts that do nothing and then one post that goes viral, and no one remembers the 50 stupid posts, and they only remember the post that goes viral. So just put stuff out there and see what goes. There's really no downside to it. And so that's kind of the mentality I've had, is just keep pushing content and, let people discover it. That's the best part. You're helping them understand the world. And I think that in and of itself is a pretty good goal.
Yeah, so one thing I found kind of fascinating about your answer is that like you sort of developed like a loyal enough readership that like if you have something that like you think that they wouldn't be that interested in, the fact that like you're the one that's writing it, that like you have the ability to shape their interests a little bit and like get them to be more interested in stuff that like they wouldn't ordinarily be interested in. Do you think the
Mm-hmm.
readers may have had like a similar effect on you, where like you observing those readers has like essentially a changed like your interest in this topic a little bit?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's very much a symbiotic relationship, right? Like I think the biggest thing for me on my side is I realize that people come to me because they think I'm a trusted sort of neutral resource when it comes to this stuff. And I think, by the way, I think that's a really interesting, larger conversation about media, which is that like so many large voices are coded on these issues, left or right. And I try to code myself as neither, which which I think in some ways actually makes my follower count on social media lower than other people.
Well, you theoretically you could code yourself as like a big milk toast AEI person, I think, if you wanted to.
I have spoken at AEI. I mean, I don't have a problem with those guys, but that also codes me a little bit right wing because AEI is right wing, right? But I've also spoken at like the ELCA gatherings, which are like super liberal. I think there's a value in this current environment of like this guy gives us data with as little bias as humanly possible. And I think there's a tremendous value in that by itself, because it means that you can be seen by left, right, and center as being a credible source. So I think that's my governing principle, is like, don't put too much of my own opinion. I don't get in the hot take industry, and I'll tell you why. It's almost self-protective, because I can say something with data and say, well, this is what the data says. And then if they attack me, it's like, I'm not saying it. The data's saying it. Like, I don't have an opinion. I have facts. Here's the facts. Deal with it. And I think that's kind of personally insulated me from a lot of the worst attacks that other people get online. Like I could not be in the hot take industry. Like that would just destroy me, psychologically. So this has allowed me to build a platform that sort of sidesteps all that flamethrower stuff online. I can just say, well, let me roll some grenades in the room and I get to walk away and you deal with what it means.
So what are some grenades that you've rolled away into the room that you thought were like extremely impactful?
I mean, I think the one that's going to probably far outlive me is the idea that evangelical is not a religious term anymore. It's a political and cultural term being picked up by non-religious people or non-evangelical or non-Christian people, like the rise of the Muslim evangelical and the Catholic evangelical and the Jewish evangelical. Like that's going to go on my tombstone, I feel like, at some point. I mean, that's a hot take. And I've had some people get really mad at me about that. Like, you cannot be Jewish and be evangelical. I go, well, then talk to 700 people in the survey who said they were. Tell them they're wrong. So all my job is to do is say, this is showing up in the data. Let me try to figure out if this is just real or just some sort of weird survey. Like I have a post running on Thursday where I basically say, like, there's this huge problem with a survey I've been using, and I just noticed it right now. Let me lay out how I found that out and what that might mean. That's my job, is just to show you the data. So that's one. The other one is probably like the idea that more education means people are more likely to go to religious services, not less likely to go to religious services. That really angers a lot of vitriolic atheists, like zealous atheists online.
Wait, could you explain your take on like the relationship between education and religious attending?
Yeah. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be a weekly attender of religious services. And that has been true in every wave of this cooperative election study going back to 2008. It's also true in the GSS. Actually, I've never found a single data source where it's negative. I found some data source where it's neutral, no relationship, but it's either positive or neutral, and more likely than it's positive. You control for stuff, it's still positive. Control for age, control for gender, it's always positive. And it's not just that, by the way. It's education and income. The most likely people to go to church this Sunday are people who have a 4-year college degree and make between $60,000 and $100,000 a year. Like that's the magic number, and people, for whatever reason, just really don't like that conclusion.
Okay, so like what if it's the sort of thing where like income is the confounding factor where the relationship is actually income, and like the fact that we perceive it as education is because we're not controlling for income.
So if you actually control for one and then look at the other, it still sticks out. But because I think, okay, so here's the second, like we're like let's go to a causality class for a second. The problem is education is correlated with all kinds of things, like positive things, like for instance, institutional trust and interpersonal trust are both strongly related to education. More educated you are, more interpersonal trust you have, and more institutional trust you have. And guess what makes you more likely to go to church? Having higher institutional trust and interpersonal trust. Now, does getting an education mean you're more trusting, or does being more trusting mean you're more likely to get more education?
Or both.
Or both, right? We don't know what way the causal arrows go. All I can say is here's the recipe. You know what I mean? Like, here are the parts that seem like they work together in such a way that lead to this outcome that I think is a good thing. I think religious attendance is, I think the best part about religion is going to the religious gathering thing. So whatever gets people there, I'm a big fan of that for all kinds of non-religious reasons. And so, I mean, my job is to say, here's what the factors are that lead people to be more likely to show up. Now go do those things.
Okay, so like, do you think that there is like some kind of persistent myth about what the average atheist is like in terms of like how educated they are or like how much money they make?
So funny you mentioned this. I am in the middle of a Templeton grant right now. They gave us a whole bunch of money to do a big survey of non-religious Americans. We did 15,000. No, well, the total sample is over 15,000. 12,000 of them were non-religious and 3,000 are religious. And I basically just spent all day yesterday trying to figure out, like, using AI, trying to figure out a way to cluster non-religious people into different categories. And interestingly enough,
Oh,
atheists sort of.
is this might be a good transition to explain the different types of nuns
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so there's 3 types of nuns using the Pew setup.
and also explain what nuns are.
Yeah, okay, NONES, people who claim no religion on a survey. That's a nun. Atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. Those are the 3 categories that Pew established like 20 years ago and they put on surveys. And we've been using it now without sort of like any sort of addendums or modifications for 20 years. And the more I look at the nuns, it's like there's got to be differences. Like those three categories are not a very good way to categorize the nuns. And so what you see is really atheist agnostics can be split not on are they atheist or agnostic, but how zealous they are about their atheism or agnosticism, right? So,
Oh yeah, like whether they're like a casual atheist that doesn't care,
mhm.
or whether they're like actively anti-theistic and they like worship Richard Dawkins or whatever.
Yeah, so the way we do it, like the two category, this is like, hey, a little sneak peek here. This is like fresh stuff. The way I'm called categorizing them is like zealous nuns and libertarian nuns. Like zealous nuns are like, I don't believe in religion and you shouldn't either. Like religion is bad. Like they really have an antagonistic view of religion. They tend to be younger too, by the way. Think about when I have in my head who these zealous nuns are, it's like the guys on Reddit who just troll the comments and like say like Sky Daddy and stuff like that. Those are your zealous nuns. Now, your libertarian nuns tend to be older, tend to have higher levels of education, and they really don't like religion, but they're just not that angry about it. You know, like if you want to be religious, that's okay-ish, I guess. But I would prefer if you didn't. That none of them try to convince anyone else to become a nun. The zealous group is the one that's like, no, 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 you need to be like me. So I think that to me is a primary wedge that we haven't seen in non-religious Americans is their orientation towards if you're one of these nuns and I say I'm a religious person, what is your posture towards me? Is it trying to convince me to leave religion, or it's like, well, hey man, live and let live? And I think that's a really important cleavage that I'm going to explore more, hopefully, in the next project.
Yeah. So I guess when it comes to like the people that are not affiliated with religion that we refer to as nuns, and is obviously I like the distinction you made about they're spelled Nones and not like nun as in like the Catholic nun. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So could you talk a little bit about so like these are like people that are not religiously affiliated. Could you talk a little bit about what you found in the data about like the extent to which they had been increasing over the course of the 21st century?
Yeah. So in 1972, 5% of Americans were nuns, and they were called the neglected category back in those days by sociology. Like no one studied nuns in the 1960s. They're like, we know they're non-religious people, but there are not very many of them, and we can't figure them out. So, and by 1991, it only had increased to 6%. So, like in a 20-year stretch, like statistically, that's nothing. But man, from that point forward, it was just like boom, up and to the right, you know. And so, from 1991 to 2022,
And just to be clear, when you say up and to the right, you don't mean that like they're like politically to the right. You just
no,
mean like a graph with a positive slope.
yeah, think of a
Yeah.
hockey stick. Yeah,
Yeah.
think of a hockey stick, right? So like 72 to 91 is the flat part of the blade, and then the handle is 1991 onward. And so now the share of Americans who are nuns is probably about 30%, depending on what survey you look at. Some are higher, some are lower. Amongst Generation Z, it's somewhere between 40 and 45%. So we're talking, I think it's the most dramatic shift in American, well, in my lifetime, in American culture. And they're larger than the evangelicals are 20% of America, mainline Protestants are 10% of America. So the nuns are just huge in size and scope and characteristics. And what's funny is they are in the neglected category in some ways because we haven't fully understood them in a way beyond like, well, they're non-religious, you know, and I think that's the next wave of social science is trying to pull them apart and make more sense of them.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I find interesting is that like so nuns have been increasing over time, but there's also like a positive correlation between how educated you are and whether or not you are religiously observant. So does that mean that like when it comes to the rise of I'm just gonna use like a more colloquial term, the rise of like non-religious people in America, a lot of that is like happening under like people that are like part of the working class that aren't as online?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point is like most to use the old classification scheme. If you put five non-religious people in a room, one would be an atheist, one would be an agnostic, and three would be nothing in particular. Right. So most nuns, and we actually the old classification scheme was atheist agnostics are secular people, and nothing in particular people are non-religious people. So atheist agnostics are not religious, but they've embraced this separate identity based on empiricism and secular identity and things like that. The non-religious people are just non-religious. Like they're defined by what they're not. They're not religious, but they're not secular either, and they're growing rapidly. About a quarter of Americans are nothing in particular now.
And
And the
most of these, most of that quarter of Americans are people like in the like the lower parts of the income brackets.
That's exactly to that's why like lumping all the nuns together in one group seems just dumb methodologically, because about half of atheists have a 4-year college degree. It's only 25% of nothing in particulars. And if you look at income, 32% of nothing in particulars make 50,000 a year or less and have a high school diploma or less. So low SES across the board. Amongst atheists, it's only 12%. So like these are not the same groups at all. And I think they got to non-religion through completely different routes that it's unfair to those two groups to lump them together.
Yeah, so maybe like our pop culture idea of a like someone that isn't religious might be some like atheist that like either like is actively anti-theistic, or like even if they're more libertarian, they still very firmly believe that there isn't a religion. But maybe that's our pop culture idea of what a not religious person is, because those are the ones that are like more educated and more vocal online, essentially.
My common refrain has been, you don't see who isn't there, and you don't hear voices who don't speak up. And a lot of nothing in particular is just don't, they're dropping out. I wrote a post on my Substack called "Dropping Out of Everything," and like nothing in particular are the people who are the most likely to describe their political affiliation as other or third party. They're the most likely to not identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. They're the least likely to participate in political processes. They have the lowest level of education. So you see this like sort of like this buffet of ideas coming together into this like larger idea. There's a growing number of Americans who are just like done with it all. And that to me, from a social
Like they're
science
done
perspective,
with both theism and atheism.
they're done with not just religion, they're done with education, they're done with everything in American life. They're done with the political system. Like they're done. And that's scary because, if you want to see like why democracy dies, it's because people stop participating in it because they feel like they have no efficacy, right? Like they can't change the system. And I think in some ways Donald Trump like ties into this because he's like a guy who's like, I'm looking out for the unseen. You know what I mean? Like the deplorables. And a lot of these people feel like they're deplorable. So I think that to me is really, really scary. And it's an undocumented part of what American society is doing, just the dropouts.
Yeah, so like the whole thing about how we tend to not see the people who don't speak up. And in this specific analogy, the people that don't speak up are the people where like when it comes to their religious affiliation, we would code them as like nothing in particular, so not atheistic and also not theistic and also not agnostic at the same time. So like if we can't find these people on like online discussion boards, and we can't find them in churches, and we can't find them in like spaces that might be more atheistic, like do we general like how do we find out what these people are thinking? Do we use like survey data, or do we just like rely on like whenever like a journalist like Jessica Groves would be talking to them or something?
That's the hardest question I get asked by journalists, by the way. Could you find me in nothing in particular? And I'm like, no, not really.
Yeah.
It's so funny because they're like everywhere but nowhere at the same time. And the way I think about this group, which is not completely data informed, but it is somewhat data informed, is like I think they're the kind of people who are working the crappy jobs, making $40,000 a year at a factory or
Or at
at
like a
home.
7-Eleven.
Yeah, like a Home Depot. You know what I mean? Like the crappy part of the service economy where there's really no chance of moving up, and they really don't have enough money to like travel or do fun things. And so like their whole life is just kind of, I also think so. The bigger thing I think about this group is these are kind of people who grew up in households, probably a one parent household, maybe not, but their parents both got high school diplomas and didn't go beyond that, and worked in the local factory and had pretty decent life because factory work used to be pretty good work in America, and now that same job pays half as much as it used to, based on inflation and everything else. So they
Yeah,
wanted
like
to
the decline in wages among working class men.
Exactly right. And I think a lot of them are really stuck with this hopeless feeling of like, my life is going to be demonstrably worse than my parents' life, and there's no way out. And I think that we've hit peak productivity in America for some segment of the economy. Like we have hit, like prosperity is not going to be what it is in 50 years for most Americans. Now, for some of us, it's going to be even better, but the haves and the have-nots are getting bigger and bigger every day. And I think them rejecting religion is part of that larger thing of like, well, society doesn't work for me, so I'm not going to work for it. Goodbye.
So yeah, like the split between the haves and have-nots, where the haves are people that are like at least comfortably middle class. Like anyone who makes like 200K a year is very like clearly in that camp. Whereas like people that might be like that aren't in the top 20%, that are like a lot more likely to be nothing in particular, and like aren't, but like the problem is that they're not as vocal online, and they're not as vocal in spaces where it would be easy to hear what they would have to say. So like
You,
what
yeah.
do you know of any tactics, or like do you know of any ways to figure out what they have like what nothing in particulars have to say about religion?
So the survey that we just did asked a bunch of questions about religion, like in a more nuanced way. Like, do you feel religion's a form of child abuse? Do you think religion should be eradicated? Do you think that religion is based on faulty moral precepts? Just trying to like figure out like, and we ask questions like, how important is religion to you versus how important spirituality is for you? And we ask questions about like, do you meditate? Do you do yoga? Do you do a nature walk? Do you know like what are these spiritual activities for you? So I think a lot of the problem is the survey data that we use typically is just not designed to answer these questions about religion. It's designed to do something else, and like religion's glommed on. But the definite sense you get is the vast majority of Americans think that they're at least spiritual at some level. So we ask a bunch of questions about the afterlife. Like when you die, is your soul end? Are you going to see your loved ones? Like things like that. And the vast majority of nothing in particular say yes. So like they believe in an afterlife. We ask questions about karma. Like people will get what they deserve, and a lot of people believe in karma too. So I think there's just this spirituality in the groundwater that nothing in particular is. Now, there, by the way, of the four categories we created, one is like almost not spiritual at all and not religious at all. So they're like done. Like no, no, no. But the
Like
nothing
would they count as atheists?
yeah, they would count as atheists, but not just any kind of atheists, like the zealous atheists, right? Who are like, nah, I'm done with all that crap. Screw all of it. We actually, the four categories I think are like, I call one Ninos, nuns in name only. So they look religious. It just classifies none for whatever dumb reason. They're like, yeah, like I'm not Protestant, but I'm also. So that's one. And then one is spiritual but not religious, which is a category we hear about a lot, right? Which is like, I don't believe in religion, but I do spiritual things.
Is there like religious but not spiritual?
No, well, not in this sample because it's all like nuns are not going to qualify as religious. There are people like that though. It's like the new wave of like fundamentalists will like reject spirituality language.
Yeah. Let's go back to talking about nuns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Ninos, SBNRs, and then there's like the two we talked about before, the zealous, non-religious, and the libertarian, non-religious, right? Which are like, I think those are like the four. I think that's the best way to think about the nuns now is those four categories as opposed to the current scheme we've been using for 15, 20 years.
Yeah. So I guess like what are some of the like what would you say have been some of the causes for the increases in nuns over the past like decade or two?
Well, I mean, politics for God's sakes. We can't discount the role of politics because I am a political scientist by training. So about 50% of liberals identify with no religion, and it's only about 15% of conservatives. So, we call it the God gap or the Pew gap. I mean, I think we don't, if you take like you guys zoom out and look at the American religious political landscape, what you see is the Republican Party is basically the party of religion, especially white religion. 75% of Republicans are white Christians. It's less than half of Democrats, and
75%, that's still lower than before, right?
it is lower, yeah. But considering the fact that only about 48% of America is white Christian, and one party is basically sucking up all that. I wrote a post called "The Coming Extinction of the White Christian Democrat." Only 20% of Americans today are white Christian Democrats. Like it's almost like in 50 years ago, 40% of Americans were white Christian Democrats. So it's like it's become an extinct thing. So the Democratic Party has become the party of non-religious people, but also non-white Christians, so Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, but also the party of non-Christians like Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus. So it's this weird amalgam of like these bunch of different disparate parts that basically it's like, are you a white and Christian person? Then you're a Republican. Are you not white and Christian? Then you're a Democrat. Like that's the way that the landscape looks right now.
Yeah. Um, so I guess what specific policies do you think Democrats and Republicans have pushed that have played a role in both the increasing secularization of society and the increased sorting in terms of like how like Republicans are far more religious than Democrats.
I think it's more about rhetoric than substance at some point. Like the Republican Party talks about God and country a lot and patriotism and all those things, and those get coded a certain kind of way in the minds of a lot of people. But I will say this, I think that there's coming fights happening, right? So the one that I really think about a lot is the Equality Act, which is this bill that was proposed in Congress but never actually passed, which would basically say that no organization in America could discriminate against someone based on their gender identity or sexual orientation, which it polls really well if you describe it that way. But in one iteration, it would say to churches that if you, let's say you were a Catholic parish and you had school teachers teaching, third graders, and one came out as being transgender, that Catholic church could not fire that teacher because that would be a discrimination. And I think that is like one of those issues where the Republican Party wants to push that because it really cleaves out any religious Democrats that are left over and pushes them to the Republican side. So I think in some ways the parties are trying to drive this God gap even bigger because the Republicans think it helps them, when actually one of the downstream effects of that is it can actually push some religious people away from religion because it continues to focus the most important part of religion towards who can we discriminate against, or who can we hate, or who can we legislate against. And I think unfortunately that's the way religion is being framed in the political discourse right now, is like how hateful can it be? How intolerant can it be?
Yeah, so I think I know your answer to this already, but I still want to ask it just to be like 100% sure. Would you
Yeah.
say that in general, like Christianity in America is coded as right wing?
Why is that?
Like, well, so just to be clear, so the first question is, would you accept the premise of the question? And
Yeah.
the second question is why?
So Christianity in America is definitely coded right wing, and it has been for probably at least the 1950s or 1960s. And why is that? That's a good
Like
question.
even with like when certain Democrats, like for example, Barack Obama, definitely tried to present themselves as devout Christians.
Oh, Hillary Clinton was a United Methodist, for God's sakes. You know what I mean? Like, listen, Joe Biden's the most religious president we've had in 50 years. And he's coded, and religious people don't like him by and large. I think what's happened is that Christianity in America is almost seen as an hegemony. It's like and the left likes to rail against the dominant thing. So whether it's whiteness or it's patriarchy or it's Christianity, the left likes to react against that and go the other direction. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why we code white Christianity, but also the fact that just white people are Republicans now overwhelmingly, when that was not the case. By the way, that was not the case even 20 years ago. I want to make that point. Like the county I grew up in was a rural county in Illinois. My first election was Bush v. Gore. It was 51% for Bush and 48% for Gore. And that was 24 years ago. And now my county that grew up in is 75% Trump, 25% Biden. So I think part of it is the fact that white is coded with Christianity, and both have moved right over time. And I think that's really kind of what makes it what it is in American life today.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess I find that kind of interesting. So like I wonder if how much of this is like an active decision from the parties and how much of it is like a little bit of the reverse. So I guess then the natural question to ask as a result is like on average, would you say that like the average churchgoer, and like we're not like sorting between parties at this point, we're just trying to look at like whatever the median churchgoer is, would you say that they tend to have more like right-leaning political views than an average atheist or an average agnostic or an average nothing in particular?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think it's not as right wing as you think it is. You know what I mean? I think the perception that you hear is like, oh, these churchgoers hate gay people and hate abortion and hate trans people. If you look at data enough, what you realize is that the vast majority of Americans are pragmatic on lots of issues, right? So, like on the issue of abortion, the overwhelming sense you get from the data is like most church going people don't think it's a good thing. They actually might think it's a sinful thing, but they also understand that that's their moral framework and not everyone's moral framework. And if someone wants to make that decision, that's on them, not on us.
So like they think it's safe, legal, and like it should be safe, legal, and rare.
I will say everywhere in the world that I think the best mantra the Democratic Party can have right now on abortion is safe, legal, and rare, because most Americans agree. And by the way, whenever like Dobbs happened, that was like someone started saying that, and the Democratic Party tried to change the messaging, say don't say it's rare because that stigmatizes abortion. We don't want to stigmatize abortion. And I think that the data says that we should probably stigmatize abortion a bit more. Very few people think it's like a good, like, I got an abortion. Congratulations. Like, people aren't going to
And
do that.
right now you're this is the part where you try to cover yourself by saying that you're talking from a purely pragmatic point of view.
Absolutely. Because here's the alternative, right? This is what I've been telling my evangelical friends left, right, and center all day long. Here's the problem. Most Americans think abortion should be legal in this country. That's a statistical fact. Okay. Depending on what poll you look at, it's probably at least 60% think that abortion should be legal on demand to a certain point, probably 10 or 12 or 14 weeks. Okay. So if you want abortion to be illegal in this country, you've got two options. One is to cram it down their throat legislatively, or two is to convince a majority of Americans that your opinion is right. And I think by taking option one, you're actually you're making your job harder because there's been a hardcore backlash against the pro-life position over the last 5 years because it was done from the top down, not the bottom up. I'm a big believer in democracy, right? Like, we've got to convince people that our view is right, not shove it down. I don't like there's this whole like strain on the right. The law is a moral teacher. No, no, no. You got to convince hearts and minds of what's moral, and then the law will reflect those hearts and minds. So I think this should be a bottom-up approach. And I've been telling evangelicals all the time, if you look at the data, by the way, the share of Americans who believe that abortion is murder and women should be jailed for seeking abortions is about 7%. 7%. And yet, that's a position that you see on social media a lot, although it represents a fringe part of American politics right now.
Yeah. Um, so what do you like? So like the whole thing about how like the actual percentage of Americans that would believe that A, abortion is murder, and B, like women should be jailed for seeking abortions is in the single digits. So I guess then the question is, do you think the Republican Party is like both their platform in terms of their rhetoric and their policy with regards to abortion, do you think that's playing a role in the increasing secularization of society?
Absolutely. I think you're seeing it with young women. It's like the data says that young women are leaving religion faster than young men are. And I don't want to overly make things simplistic, but the fact of the matter is that women had a right to an abortion up to the first trimester for 50 years, and then it was gone. I think a lot of them were like, yeah, they didn't think about abortion much because they had access to an abortion. And then all of a sudden they didn't anymore. And who are they going to blame for that? Well, the Supreme Court. And why the Supreme Court? Well, because there's a lot of really religious people on the Supreme Court now. So we're going to blame religion. Like, that's how they made that connection in their minds. And I think in a lot of ways that drove a lot of young women away from religion because all they see is being patriarchal and anti-abortion.
Yeah. I think yeah, this brings us to like a very interesting topic. So could you explain the gender divide with regards to who's leaving church and the way that that splits a little bit among age groups, income groups, etc.?
Yeah, yeah. So this is interesting. For a long time, we've sort of known, and I'm using known in air quotes here, like known that women are more religious than men. Like, it's
When you
just one of
say
those.
known, do you think that was the pop culture idea, or do you think like social scientists would just assume it based on the data?
No, the data said it, but like, we couldn't figure out why.
Yeah, so the
Which,
data would traditionally say that women were like more religious than men, and we
nope.
didn't know if it was a cultural thing, if it was a biological thing, if it was something else.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not just in America. This is like in multiple countries. Like, Pew did a whole study of this. And then in the last couple of years, things have changed, and now young women, so like Gen Z women, so like 18 to 25-year-old women, are more likely to say they're non-religious compared to men in the same age category. And now it's important to point out they're not more likely to say they're atheist agnostic. They're much more likely to say they're nothing in particular. Women are not drawn to the atheist agnostic label. I think they see it as toxic because it represents a bunch of white dudes, and they're not white dudes. So that's a big change. And I wrote a post today about this. And interestingly enough, if you look at the relationship between attendance and education and you break it down by gender, educated men are much more likely to be weekly church attenders compared to educated women. And I think that's really, really telling about this gender gap and this how education plays into the whole thing.
Yeah, that seems to be like that seems to like even go against like my preconceived understanding of these things would just be the idea that women were more likely to be weekly churchgoers than men. So do you think that is a sort of thing where it used to be true and now it's not true? And if it's so, is it just because of like Gen Z women like splitting because of the church's policies in regards to stuff like abortion?
I think it's probably also that there's this like strain amongst younger men, and this is like anecdotal, not data driven yet, but it will be at some point. Young men seem to be like reacting to this move on things like LGBTQ. right? Like they seem like you're seeing this, especially Twitter's a weird space because it's like kind of coded right now, but you see a lot of like these anon accounts who really are like super patriarchal, super anti-LGBTQ, super religious too. I think religion's being like it's being seen as a way to like return to cultural norms. And I think that's men are doing that more than women. I think young men are perceiving this landscape where like everything's just moral chaos and religion is like this firm foundation in this era of moral uncertainty. And they're being drawn to that while women are seeing religion as the opposite of that. They're seeing it as like this place that bears down on them and makes them have less rights.
What was the general idea about what men and thought about what was the general idea about how men and women thought about religion, say like 20 years ago?
I mean, I think the most dominant theory was that men are just less social than women, which is like, one of
Well,
those things
I
where
think that's still true.
yeah, I mean, I think it is true, but I also think religion's a social thing, right? Like my dad went to church growing up, but as soon as the benediction happened, he'd be the first guy out the door in the back. You know what I'm saying? Like he did not want the social part at all. He only saw the spiritual part. And women would hang around the pews and talk for half an hour after church. And I think that is actually a really important distinction about religion, right? The social aspect is a really important part. And for some people, the social aspect is the reason they go. And for some people, the social aspect is the reason they don't go because they don't want to be around other people. And I think that's an important thing when we talk about the gender divide too.
Yeah. So I guess so like would you say that in general when it comes to nowadays both men and women are leaving the church, but women are leaving the church at greater numbers?
That's it. Yeah, the number keeps going up. It's just the slope of the line for women continues to go up in a sort of, the same rate. And for men, it's sort of leveled off or going up a lot slower amongst younger men versus younger women. And I don't know if that's this is just like a 5 year window of weirdness and it's going to return back to the norm in 10 years, or if this is going to represent the future trajectory of gender and religion in America.
Yeah, you said 5 year weirdness. Like when it comes to like men and women, they both leave church, but they leave church at like slightly different rates where women leave church at higher rates. And you
Mm-hmm.
said like that's just like it's like the rates are really weird for like 5 years. Is
Yeah.
that like do you think it's because of the pandemic?
So my take on the pandemic is that I don't think it had some sort of like stochastic impact on religion in America. I think it honestly, if you like, so here's a one data point that drives that home for me. I looked at burials and baptisms and confirmations in the Episcopal Church, and they published this data, which is fantastic. So what I did was I shot a straight line through the trend before COVID, from like 2010 to 2020 or 2019, and then I projected how many like baptisms they would do in 2023. And guess what? The number was exactly where it was supposed to be in 2023 based on the trend line if you take out the COVID years, which were obviously an aberration. So I honestly think what happened during COVID was it was just did religion decline during COVID? Yes. You know why? Because religion's been declining for 40 years. So you would not expect it to not decline during COVID. I think if it did accelerate things, here's how it did that. Their people die all the time. Don't know if you knew that or not. Typically older people
I
die.
had no idea.
I know it's a revolutionary concept. And you know who COVID killed a lot of? Older people. So I do think there was at least some effect of people left church because of COVID and didn't come back, and they might have died or gotten sick or become shut-ins during that 3 or 4 year window of time, and that is what might have driven religion down a little bit faster. I don't think it was people actually leaving religion. It was just that generational replacement thing kind of got accelerated a little bit because of COVID and its impact on church attendance.
Yeah, so there's this one New York Times columnist, Jessica Groves, that I was talking to last year because she did what I thought was an excellent series about the decline of religion. So she postulated this theory based on like her talking to a bunch of like people that were like she was doing a bunch of survey data and stuff. So she postulated that maybe part of the reason why like like religion declined during the COVID years was just because people found that like online participation in church attendance wasn't as meaningful. And so like they just like stopped going. And then once like church attendance became in person again, they just like lost that sort of anchor in terms of that being a habit in their lives. So they just went away like in that sort of like not with a bang, but a whimper. Would you find that plausible?
Yeah, so I actually was working with some data from Pew where they ask about, do you attend church online? Do you attend church in person? And then what do you think about online church versus in-person church? And what's fascinating is like no one prefers online church to in-person church. And it's big numbers too. Like even amongst the youngest Americans, like 18 to 30-year-olds, two-thirds of them still thought that in-person church was superior to online church. And then when you get to like 50 years old, it's like 85% prefer in-person church and 15% prefer online church. There is no future in America where like online religion. And I mean, I know like so many churches that I talk to are like, oh, we got this really robust online community. And what I really want to tell them is, no, you don't. You got some people who halfway watch on YouTube while they're doing the dishes or doing something else. You
Or
know, like
like playing Mario Kart on their
it,
Switch. Yeah.
exactly right. Like, and they're not really forming a strong bond. Like, if you understand what religion is, like in the classic sense, what they're doing is not in any way religion. They might as well be watching the Golden Girls. Like, it is not doing any. What you actually find, interestingly enough, is the people who are the most likely to watch online church are those who attend in-person church once a week or more. So it's like they're like super heavy consumers of religion, and it gives them one more way to access religion when they don't have church on Sunday. So they'll watch other religious services throughout the week. It's not. They're like 5% of Americans are like virtual church attenders, where they go like less than once a month in person, but like are there every week online, and they tend to be African American. They tend to be lower educated, and they tend to be poorer. So like it's this weird group of people that I just think that we got sold this bill of goods, like, oh, online church is a good idea. And you look at the data and you're like, I just don't, there's not a huge untapped market there that you're reaching out to. So, but the question is, do you turn that off? Do you turn the stream off? Because now that 5% of Americans now has no access. So I don't know what the solution is. What I know is that no one prefers going, not no one, almost no one prefers going online to in person.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to go back to talking about gender divide with regards to who's leaving church?
Sure, I don't talk about whatever you want to talk about.
All right. So like when it comes to like what we've observed that both men and women are leaving church. And so women are leaving church more than men, but they're still both leaving church. So do you
Mm-hmm.
think that like men have different reasons for leaving church compared to the reasons why women leave church?
Oh, yeah, but I think it's hard to know. You know what I mean? Like we did a whole survey of why evangelicals left. We called it Great Dechurching with Michael Graham and Jim Davis. And what's funny is the overriding sense you got from that was friends or why people would come back. It's like, do I need to make new friends? I moved in a new community. My friends start going. And why do people leave? None of the answers that you hear online are actually what people gave us. So it wasn't like, well, I was gay, or my church started talking about politics, or I had like a theological disagreement. So I think one of the black boxes that I don't think we'll ever figure out is why people leave religion. Because I think for some of them, they can't even articulate well to you. If you talk to them 3 times over the course of a year after they left church, why they left, they would probably give you a different answer time A, time B, and time C because they've thought about it more. Maybe in time A it was like, well, the pastor is something I disagree with. And then year C was like, well, I wasn't really religious that much anyway. So I think it's trying to name something that's almost nameless and describe something that's so amorphous that I'm not sure we'll ever come to real conclusions about stuff like that.
Yeah, and maybe like another problem when it comes to trying to unpack this data is that people tend to overestimate how salient these issues are, especially to nothing in particulars, where sometimes when you actually manage to find a wild nothing in particular, like doing stuff and like hey, this is someone that isn't strongly theistic, not strongly atheistic, not strongly agnostic. Let's ask them a couple questions. It's possible that they just like give like whatever answer they just thought of like within 5 seconds because they never actually thought about it that strongly, and then it's therefore hard for us to figure out like what's actually going on when it comes to these trends on a broader scale.
Mm-hmm. That's the problem. Is I tell my students this constantly. No one thinks about these problems as much as you do. Like you cannot put your schema, your mental scaffolding on someone else because I think about religion most of the day for one reason or another. Most people probably think about religion one day a year, 2 days a year at most. And so it's like I'm trying to like put my viewpoint on them, which is unfair to them. So I have to constantly check myself and say, no one thinks about this stuff as much as I do. Like I'm the guy at the dinner party is like, tell me about your job. because I don't want to talk about my job because I do it all the time. Like that's all I do is talk about my job. So I think that's really important in studying religion is we want to act like it's like this great cosmic battle between good and evil, why people leave religion. And the answer for a lot of people is I just moved or I got a new job or we had a kid and the kid's bad. Like they cry all the time. Like those are
Yeah.
reasons why
Or
people
my
leave religion.
kid enrolled in sports and like
Yes. Yes. Like it's not some like we sat down and prayed about it and discerned that we didn't want to come to church anymore. It's just like some random thing happened. And that's the problem with social sciences. We want to create like great meaning out of meaninglessness sometimes. And I'm trying to reject that as much as I can.
yeah, so like what are some examples of like there's a decline in religious attendance somewhere and like social scientists try to come up with some grand meaning. They they synthesize a bunch of data and a bunch of like survey responses and say, "Oh, we think it's because of reason A, reason B, and reason C," where like by contrast, you think it's all BS.
So there's this okay. So there's this huge literature out there about like does religion hinder democracy or promote democracy, right? Like, which is a really interesting question, right? The problem, however, is it assumes that people are religious. Most people like religion actually has a measurable impact on the way they engage in social life, which is a huge leap in logic, right? And the other problem with this is religion is not the same across most of the world. Like some religions are very communal, right? Like the Catholic Church is a very communal religion. A lot of religion is very isolating. It's very individualized. For instance, Protestant Christianity is about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Eastern religion and Western religion don't work the same way. Even amongst Islam, there's some Islam that's you go to 5 times a day you pray, and a lot of Muslims are just like I go a couple on the high holy days and that's it. So the problem is you're trying to like say religion does this, but it's like there's 1,000 different kinds of religion, and the way it's practiced just varies inside that own country. So
Yeah, like inside that own country, like even with people that follow the same religion within that country.
absolutely. Like it'd be like saying, well, like in whatever you learn in America, like does religion promote democracy in America? Has absolutely no applicability to any country outside America because for a bunch of reasons.
Even
We have a
Canada.
No, even Canada, because we have a two-party system in America, which makes us completely unique in most parts of the world. And two, we're incredibly religious and incredibly religiously diverse. So it's like you can study this problem all you want. And I like that problem, by the way, because I'm an Americanist. But like I can't go to Europe and tell that story because like the Europeans look around, like the Danish are looking around and going, no one goes to church here anyway. What the world are you talking about, dude? Like, it doesn't edify anything here. So I just think that here's the problem that academics have is we like if you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. It's like, well,
Yeah, and if
religion is
other people have the same hammer, then it bolsters your own opinion that everything is a nail.
like listen, I was just at a thing with a bunch of other social scientists talking about religious yearning. And actually a really good question, which I thought was really kind of it cautioned us all was do people actually yearn for religion? Like, is that a bad assumption that people like everyone has like to use a Tycho Brahe phrase, everyone has a God-shaped hole in their heart? Like, maybe that's not true. Maybe some people just don't give two rips about religion, and we should just take them for their word that it makes no good or bad difference in their life that they don't have a God-shaped hole.
Yeah. I think that's a neat segue because I still can't believe we went this entire interview so far without addressing this. So in general, when it comes to like how social scientists measure like how religious someone is, they tend to like measure like how religious you are when it comes to the three beliefs. I'm sorry, the three B's, which are belief, belonging, and I forgot the third one.
Behavior.
Okay, so like yeah, in general, when it comes to people who are religious, like we measure how religious they are when it comes to the three B's, belief, behavior, and belonging. So could you explain those three?
Can I explain the three B's? Yeah. So, religion is a multifaceted concept. Some people, I mean, the one when I ask you like on a survey, like, are you religious? I think the first thing to think of is like, do I believe in God? Things like that. Like, do I have a theological assent toward religion? What's funny about belief is it's actually the hardest one to measure and the one I care about the least, to be honest with you. Like from a social science perspective, belief, I could use other proxies for that.
Well, okay, explain a little bit about belief.
Yeah. So like questions like how do you view the Bible would be like a very Amerocentric way to measure belief. But like things like do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in God? Or do you believe in demons and in hell and heaven? How certain are you of your religious beliefs? Those are all kind of belief questions. Um, those questions are actually not that good because no one agrees on them. Like every time you ask a question, well, what do you believe about God? Everyone goes, well, I kind of think two's good, but not really. I like number three. Like it's hard to take this like mushy thing and then box it into 5 buckets because the buckets will never fully capture what the thing is. So that's why I kind of steer the boat away from belief questions because I just don't like them that much. I just don't think they're that important in the grand scheme of things. So that's one. And there's belonging. Now, belonging is way easier, by the way. What's your present religion, of any? And you give you a whole bunch of options from Protestant to Catholic to Muslim to Hindu to LDS to atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. And you just check the box which one you are. It's really that simple. There also, well, it's not that simple. There's a box at the bottom called something else. After all the options, you click the something else, and then it gives you a free response box where you can type stuff in. And oh my God in heaven, that's a mess. Like it's the weirdest people in the world saying weird things. I don't even mess with those people. Like I don't even look at the something else box. But I actually think that's the most important one. Like from a social science perspective, because the way I think about it is like, even if you're like, you haven't gone to church in 2 years and I ask you what your present religion is, of any, you should be a functional none because you're not going, right? You're not like attached to it. But if you say you're Protestant or Catholic, you're still saying like in social space, those are my people. Like I still see myself as Protestant or Catholic
Yeah,
or
I
Muslim.
belong to Protestantism or I
Yes.
belong to Catholicism. That's
Yes.
what like this be of belonging. Like I belong to this tribe regardless of how much time I actually spend.
Yeah, it could be like I grew up in this tribe and then I moved away when I was 18, went to college, never come back, but I still see myself. People are like that. They'll go to like move to New York to become a famous actor and they'll be a famous actor, go, well, I still see myself as a kid from Nebraska. Like that kind of thing. Like that still matters a lot when it comes to predicting other things. Like you being a non-attending Protestant is a heck of a lot different than you being a non-attending nothing in particular. It probably means you're much more conservative, by the way, especially if you're white because you still say you're Protestant or you still say you're Catholic. So that's belonging. And then behaviors, it's the one that we typically measure is just religious attendance. Outside weddings and funerals, how often do you go to to attend religious services? And your options typically range from never to more than once a week. And that one to me is, I've always said this, like if you could say like if all three of them, which one do you want people to do? That would be the one I would want them to do, is go to a religious service on a regular basis for all kinds of good reasons. I think objectively neutral, like just good stuff from a social science perspective.
Can I play devil's advocate with this?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember talking to David French, and I think he tried his best to like downplay, like he's not denying it, but like he did a little bit to try to downplay the significance of the positive sociological side effects that come with religious attendance. Like his phrasing would be like, if you want someone to go to church, like they would go to the church because they believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and not because of the positive sociological side effects. So do you think that like us constantly saying, "Oh, we like go to church because it's good for your mental health." Do you think that like it's like essentially us like using like a little bit of trickery to like sort of get them into we're essentially like doing like backhanded proselytizing without like being overt about it, or we're just like incidentally like trying to like do this like thing that should have like a very meaningful sense of purpose and like saying don't do it for the meaningful sense of purpose, do it for like some of like the incidental empirical benefits that come with it.
Listen, I don't care why you get your butt in the seat. Just get your butt in the seat, man. Like I am a pragmatist at the end of the day, and I think a lot of people go to church for the wrong reasons, the way it is right now, and it's been that way forever. I mean, George Washington went to church so he could get votes. Like he was very clear about that. When the priest was mean to him one time, he just stopped going. A guy who believes in God is not going to do that. He's going to find another church. I, at the end of the day, there's value in being in a group of people. Period. And no, listen, let me caveat that just a little bit. If you're LGBTQ, I am not telling you to go to a fundamentalist church that says that your lifestyle is sinful. Okay. I am not telling you to do that. But outside those extremes, finding a community of people who might be slightly different than you, age wise, economic wise, education wise, race wise, is probably not the worst thing in the entire world. And gathering with people objectively makes your mental health better on balance. So why give
But
it a
why,
try?
why would this like the whole thing about improving mental health with community? Why does it have to be through church and not through like joining any other community in all of existence?
Andrew, tell me another community that you can join.
Um,
Yep. Yep. You see this pause right here? This is the problem. I will tell people, I want you to join a group, a social group that has a somewhat diversity of opinion, age, education, economics. And then I'll say, well, I don't want to go to church. I go, okay, fine, find something else. And they do exactly what you just did right there, which is there is no other third space in America right now except for religion. So here's what I tell atheists. I go, listen, I have no moral qualms about you not believing in God. That's obviously not my opinion. That's your opinion, and it's fine. But you need to find a replication for in-person religious attendance in some other way. And until you do that, I'm going to say religion is better than non-religion because you have not been able to replicate that so
Do you mean
far.
like religion in terms of the high-minded ideas, or just like the religion, like the communities that come with it?
Both more the community than the high-minded ideas, but both are good. Like I think both should happen. But I just like there is no third space. There's no Elks, there's no Moose, there's no American Legion, there's no bowling leagues, to use Putnam's term. There is nothing. There's no third space in America that comes even close to what religion does, even though religion's declining. So if you could replicate religion without religion, by the way, they've tried. There's been atheist churches
Or
before.
like, oh, or like the concept of workism by Derek Thompson.
Yes, I
Can you
do.
explain that to the audience?
No, I can't. No, go. I've heard of it, Andrew. So you put me on the spot. Tell me what it is.
All right, so basically, like the whole idea of like where are you going to find a sense of purpose and community like without
Mm-hmm.
religion? So like Derek Thompson postulated like so just for the audience, like Derek Thompson is a prominent journalist and a staff writer at The Atlantic,
Right.
and his theory is that like a lot of the people that are moving away from religion, they're essentially using like their jobs, like their day jobs, their work as like a way to replace the sense of belonging and community that they would traditionally feel from religion. That's his theory,
And
anyway.
that's bad. Like the argument I hear is like the third space argument. First space is home, second space is
Oh
work.
wait, sorry, I can't. Can you explain what third spaces are?
Yeah. So first space is home, second space is work. Third space is a non-work, non-home place where you're around other people, a social place that is not work or home.
All right,
Here's
so
the pro-
yeah, so like the like a first place would be your house, a second place would be where you go to work,
yeah.
and a third place would be like a public library or whatever.
Yeah, public library, religion, bowling league, fraternal organization, Boy Scouts, like travel baseball. Those are all third spaces. But here's the problem. During the pandemic, you know what happened? Third spaces went away completely, obviously. And for many people, second spaces became first spaces. So we went from three spaces to one. And a lot of people who work from home still only have one space. And we wonder why our mental health sucks. We are not like I read a survey like a significant portion of work from home people don't leave the house most days. I'm like, oh my God, if you want to set up a recipe to drive yourself crazy, that's a fantastic way to do that. I don't care how introverted you are. You are not designed to sit in a house and stare at a screen like this for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for the rest of your life. You will not have good mental health. I can almost guarantee it, unless you have a psychological condition, you will not have good mental health out of that. And I think the problem is we all sit around going, God, why does everything suck? Well, probably because you don't have a third space that makes any sense. And I think we need to redevelop that. Again, if you can develop a third space that's not religion, that's great. I really objectively do not care. But to this point, I have not seen it done at a scale that can even come close to what religion has done in American society over the last 200 years.
Yeah, and would you say that it's doing it like so? Like when it comes to like people are leaving church, like do you think that like the it's not like church is not acting as much of a third space as it used to be, or do you think it's just that like people that weren't traditionally religious are just like deciding not to go to church because there's no longer like a social stigma around not going to church?
I think the social stigma is really important. Like I think we all have to admit, like it's easier to be non-religious today than any point in history because it's just in the groundwater now. Like people used to be like culturally religious, now they're just not religious, which I think is important. But I also think that for whatever reason, this technology that we have has made it easier than ever to not leave our house and be entertained. At the end of the day, we all want to be entertained. We're just big dumb animals. We want to see, colors and pictures and stories and feel things. Well, imagine what your great grandparents had to do that. They had the radio or hanging out with their friends. Then your parents had the radio and the TV and the record player and hanging out with friends. And now you have everything they had, plus TikTok and Twitter and Netflix and Instagram and you name it. So now it's easier than ever to entertain ourselves without leaving our house. And for a lot of people, they go, I'd rather just lay in my bed and scroll my phone all night than go to dinner with some friends. You've got to fight that urge. Like, I really think in some ways technology's broken our brains, where it used to be way more fun to go out with friends and it was way more boring to stay at home. And now it's the opposite. And yet it's killing our mental health and we're not aware of it.
Yeah. So I guess then like um what would you say are like I want to push you on this a little bit, but like
Mm-hmm.
so like you gave the idea, oh let's say that like oh if you're LGBTQ, like I'm not telling you to go to like some really fundamentalist like sect. So like what would you say are some of the downsides of religious attendance that might serve as understandable reasons for why someone would not want to like wrap a huge amount of their identity around it.
Um, so obviously a religion that would tell you that like you don't have worth would be a great thing to like turn away from religion.
Yeah, or
Okay.
that you don't have a right to exist.
Exactly. Like I think that is theological things aside, you should not put yourself where you're being like psychologically like attacked every day. That is not good, period. But also, like, I just think that there are some people in life who are okay. Here's the bigger problem: the kind of religion in America that used to say, hey, doubt's cool and it's okay to not believe very much, but you should still show up and you should try as much as you can, is declining rapidly in America. They're called the mainline Protestant church. They were
Wait, yeah,
50%.
can you explain that type of church a little bit
Yeah.
more, like what it's like?
Yeah. Because your listeners probably have never even thought about this type of church, by
Yeah,
the
no,
way.
I'm sure our listeners are like, what the hell are these people talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in the largest religious tradition in America in the 1950s was called the mainline Protestant Christianity is what they were called. And they're the seven sisters of the main line are really the emblematic ones. So like the United Methodist Church, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, American Baptists, ELCA, Evangelical Lutherans, Presbyterian Church USA, and the Episcopal Church are like the seven sisters. And they were always more like social
Wait,
justice
what are the
focused.
seven sisters?
The seven largest denominations, the ones I just listed, are the seven sisters of the
Okay,
mainline, and
got it.
almost all mainline churches are like that's almost all mainline Christianity, and they used to dominate American life, like the social gospel movement. You know, the thing that brought us the progressive era, which like child labor laws and the ballot initiative came out of the social gospel movement, which said that God cares more about making this world better than getting you to heaven. So like Christians should reform the world that we're living in right now. Like prohibition was actually driven by this movement. And you know, obviously it went off the rails in some ways, but by the way, the aim of the prohibition movement was to stop spousal abuse because men would go get drunk and come home and beat the crap out of their wives on a constant basis. So, you know, there's a strain of goodness here. Anyway, the main line was 50% of America in 1955, right? So the most dominant view of religion in America was mainline Protestant Christianity. And today it's 9% of America. Most mainline churches are half the size they were 30 years ago. Some are even smaller than that. And the average mainline Protestant now is about 60 years old. So those churches are going to be gone in probably 15, 20 years in any meaningful way in most parts of America. And all we're going to have left is evangelicalism. And evangelicalism is a very black and white way to understand faith. You know, you're either with me or you're against me. You either believe all of it or you believe none of it. You know, it's like there's a verse in the Bible like, you know, if either be hot or cold, because if you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. It comes from Revelation, meaning like you got to be all the way in. And they talk about that all the time. So I think for a lot of people who on matters of belief, they tend to be middle of the road. They can't hang in an evangelical church because they just can't do that. So they're not going to have another option. And that's the bigger problem, I think, is in the future, there's only going to be one option for religion in most parts of America, and it's going to be evangelical Christianity or maybe Catholicism, but a lot of people just can't get down with Catholics either. So,
So, like, what are some of the main cultural aspects of mainline Protestantism that differentiate it from stuff like Catholicism or evangelicalism?
so mainline Protestants tend to be not so much a literal Bible, kind of take a more interpretivist view of the Bible. They're now a lot of them are still theologically orthodox on the main points, like Jesus' death and resurrection and things like that. Culturally, they tend to be moderate politically. Now, a majority are Republicans, but they're Republicans because the mainline Protestants are white, educated, and moneyed. Like that's the old mentality of the mainline is a bunch of like college educated, you know, professors and accountants are your mainline Protestants. And so they always occupied like the mainline Protestant Christianity dominates like Congress even today, even though it's declining in the population because it's like the established religion of America. And they've always been, like just been seen as middle of the road, diverse. In terms of ideology, you get left, right, and center in a mainline church, and you wouldn't get that in an evangelical church. And the Catholic Church is obviously, it's hard to describe the Catholic Church because there's 62 million Catholics in America, but the Catholic Church in America is trending overwhelmingly to the right now. So, for instance, if you look at the self-described politics of ordained Catholic priests over time, it used to be you had a nice mix of left, right, and center. And for priests ordained in the last 10 years, 5% of them identify as liberal and 65% of them identify as conservative. So the Catholic Church now has turned overwhelmingly conservative in the last 20 years or so, and so that's a denomination that doesn't really fit for a lot, especially if you're a woman. Can't be a woman priest. And gay rights, abortion, they're very conservative too. So
Yeah, so like what aspects of the cultural part of mainline Protestantism is the sort of thing where like you think that it could appeal to a larger demographic and is the reason why you think that more people should at least try to attend those types of church services?
I think you're not going to hear you're going to go to hell because you're gay, or you're going to go to hell because you're doubting. You're going to hear God told us to serve the community and forgive each other, and work towards reconciliation and forgiveness and things like that, which, hey, you know what? This is what I was thinking about the other day. If religion's taught me anything in this world, it's to be grateful for what I have. And like, is that a bad thing? Like, I would have a really hard time with someone arguing like, no, it's bad to be grateful. If you can find a way to like remind yourself of your gratitude on a regular basis outside of religion, you should embrace that. But one of the core aspects of religion is being grateful for what you've been given. And I think that's one of those like mental health things that we don't think about because it's almost so subtle. It goes under the radar. But like counting your blessings, to use a Christian phrase, is incredibly good for your mental health because it makes you turn towards the positive side, the optimistic side every once in a while.
Yeah, this question just popped into my head. What would you say to someone who might be listening to this conversation and think that you're able to like massively delineate between the different types of Christianity, but you're not as well attuned to like all the other religions?
Well, because I'm a fallible person, man. I don't like people are like, why don't you write more about this? I go, well, why don't you write more about that? Like, I have a limited capacity as a person to understand things and work. I can only write about what I like. It's not my job to write about every religion on earth, every aspect of religion on earth, every type of religion on earth. I write about what I want to write about. If you want to learn about other stuff, I might not be the person for you. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, I can't be everything to everyone. Here's what I realized. Enough people appreciate like what my thought process is, and I can have a nice following on social media without trying to go over here and chase that squirrel and do that thing. So think along with me. If you don't want to think along with me, go find someone else to think along with. I'm not going to have 1 million followers on Substack. I know that for a fact. But I've got a pretty decent following already, and they like what I'm up to. So, I hate to like be like an athlete, but like look at the scoreboard. I'm winning. Doing what I'm doing is winning objectively. I cannot give you what you want, and I apologize for that, but I also can't give everyone what they want. I give enough people what they want to make me happy and put a little money in my pocket and feel good about myself. So, isn't that enough?
Yeah, so I'm glad about your concession about how you're fallible. But then I guess the next question would be, what would you say to as like just to qualify your own points are some of the biggest like blind spots that you have when it comes to like how like the effect that other religions have in the country?
Oh, I have no concept of how Judaism works. Like none. Like I don't understand how they view the world. I don't understand like all the like little nuances of what Judaism is. Like I'm learning things every day about like Hinduism and Islam. Like my worldview is very much shaped by my upbringing. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church in the 1990s. I'm a white kid, grew up in rural America in a conservative part of the state. Like all those things shape how I think about the world. And here's the thing about religion. I understand evangelicalism only because I was born and raised in it and I'm still kind of like adjacent to that culture. But there's parts of it I still don't even understand. And I've been doing this for 42 years now. Like I will never understand. Like Anthony Bourdain said, I've been to China 5 times. I could go 500 times and still not understand it. That's the way I feel about religion. Like, so again, to go back to what we talked about before, would you want me to try to go understand Islam? Like, I am not the messenger for that. Someone else is. And I hope they start writing a Substack and make graphs about Islam.com. I don't care. Go to them. Like I have my lane. I have my purpose. I'm pretty good at it, I think. And other people can be really good at other things that I'm not good at. I don't have to be great at everything.
Yeah, so I agree that like obviously this is the whole concept of specialization in economics. But then I guess that makes me wonder like so like when it comes to the research you do, how much of this is like you looking at like random graphs online and how much of it is like you going to places, whether it be like you going to churches or like you meeting people in person or like even just calling people. How much of this is just like you just like staring at the data as you go insane, or and how much of this is actually like on the ground reporting?
I don't go anywhere, Andrew. You think I leave my house? I only go.
Yeah, but there are other Substack writers that actually like go places. Like Alice Evans, like she does a lot of gender stuff, and like she actually like visited South Korea to figure out how gender stuff worked.
That's cool. Good for her. I can write 5 posts for not leaving my house in about 2 days, and it's really cheap and really easy.
Yeah.
I
Okay. Would you at least admit that that's a potential blind spot you have, and that like even if you have your finger on the pulse on the data, you don't have your finger on the pulse about like more specific granular cultural aspects?
I don't. But I will say this. I mean, social media does like let you like put your ear to the ground of like what the discourse is talking about, which is obviously not the same as like going to a foreign country and hanging out there for a while. But
Yeah,
I
because if
do
you go to a country and hang out there for a while, you can figure out what the nothing in particulars there think.
I listen. One time I actually got an offer to write a big editorial piece for a major publication. I'm not going to say who it was. They wanted me to interview people for part of the piece. I said no thanks. It's not called people about like one guy like got in my DMs on Twitter and was like, why don't you like do more interviews with people about religion? I go, it's called graphs about religion, dude. I do one thing. I'm really good at it. I don't have any desire to go beyond that. I really don't. Like I found what I'm good at. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like going to Michael Jordan and going, hey, you should play baseball. It'll work out great. Not saying I'm Michael Jordan or anything, but like the dude was the best basketball player on the planet. You know, like why would you take that away from him? Like let him be good at what he's good at. And you know what I also hope, Andrew, out of this whole what I'm doing is there will be 5 more people coming after me who do what I do just in a slightly different way to expand our understanding of religion. That's what I hope happens. Like I'm always like looking for who's coming next to take this role from me and like be my competition. I would love that. But up to this point, it's not happened.
Yeah. So like you're the guy where like if some journalist was doing a bunch of like social science like survey work where they would just constantly like do like send emails like and receive emails from like people when it comes to religion, you would be the guy that they would use as a supplement to like use the data and see whether it maps on to like what the surveyors are telling them, essentially. You're that type of guy.
That's my A lot of what I do is like I talk on background to reporters. I go, what are you seeing in the data that's cool? And I'll be like, oh, I see this, and there's this thing, and think about this story. A lot of what I do, which I don't talk about this publicly, but it's talk to producers of like major producers and editors of major newspapers and say, hey, you should think about doing a story on this.
Yeah.
Like just kind of nudging them in a way, and like basically saying to them, I see this as a cool avenue to explore. I don't have the tools nor the desire to explore it, but I think there's enough here to write a story about, and then they'll go write a story about it.
Yeah, so like you would tell Jessica Gross, "Oh, you should write a story about like this facet of secularization."
Yeah. Oh, there was a piece written in a major. I'm trying to be vague here on purpose. A major outlet in the last 4 weeks that was basically my idea. I don't care about that. Like, it really doesn't matter to me because, again, my job is to help explain religion. And when you're in the trenches like I am, you see all these weird things happening that no one else sees. And you go, here, look at this major producer. Like, do a story about this. And then they do the story about it and you get to learn about it without me doing the work, which is like fantastic.
So like what are some times where you suggested ideas to like other journalists? They did all the hard work and they did all the blood, sweat, and toil from the graphs that they you sent them. Like what are some times where they wrote that piece and then you learned something from them that you wouldn't have known if you were just holed up in your home looking at graphs?
Oh, there's this great piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago about church planting networks and how they operate. And like I knew some of the story because I'd heard it from people, but I didn't know the other side of the story. Like I didn't know how they raised the money. I didn't know all the like the machinations going on. And these groups, by the way, would never speak to a guy like me because I'm a researcher. And I've actually know that because some of my students tried to talk to him, they wouldn't talk to him. They spoke to a reporter though. So like being that different gives you access to that they wouldn't talk to me as an academic. So that's also part of it as well. It's like I can't even do that. If I wanted to, I couldn't do that because I'm an academic and they'd rather talk to a reporter who would get them this news article and this big publication. They could tell all their friends, hey, we got it in the Wall Street Journal. So that's part of it too.
Yeah. So like what are some potential things where like in the future you hope to nudge journalists in that direction of like you wish that like more mainstream outlets would cover this specific facet of like religious attendance and specifically Christian attendance because that's I guess that's your
That's
area
my
of
niche.
expertise.
Um, well, no, I mean the one I was just telling you about is the increasing conservatism of the Catholic priesthood. I think is an undercovered story for sure. Like I think there needs to be more discussion about what that looks like. Is that happening because the seminaries are making them more conservative? Are they coming in more conservative? Like what does that mean? I think about that story a whole lot. I also think about well, right now the Southern Baptist Convention is having their annual meeting in Indianapolis this week, and they're basically trying to become more and more conservative over time, like by making it hard. Women can't be pastors and things like that. Like, what about women who are leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention? Like, how do they navigate that weirdness of like knowing there's a really hard stained glass ceiling for them where they can't go above that? Why would they not just take one click to the left, become non-denominational, and be a pastor and be able to preach
Yeah.
every
So like
Sunday?
you would want like reporters to interview like women leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yes, there's all kinds of cool stories like that. Again, not my lane. I know what I'm good at, and this is what I always tell people: like my unfair advantage is a couple things. One, I'm a trained social scientist. Two, I'm a pastor, and three, I've built these data analysis skills over a long period of time. That's what I do better than anybody else. If it's outside that little like Venn diagram overlapping, give it to somebody else and let them do it. They'll do it faster and better than I could ever do it.
All right. Ryan Burge, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
This has been fun, man. Appreciate it.